Nikki LaDue was as bright and fiery as the afternoon Gulf Coast sun.
Well, Nikki was an absolute sweetheart. She was bubbly and vivacious, and she just shone. And she was a little bit crazy. She liked to walk on the wild side a lot.
But the wild child also had a soft side. She was a doting and dedicated divorced single mother to a young son.
She loved her child beyond anything that really can be described.
The 28-year-old worked as a dealer at a nearby casino.
Everybody wanted to be at her table because she was fun, and I think that she really kind of enjoyed it.
It was there that a roll of the dice would bring in a high-stakes win. Her future husband, Phil January.
Phil January.
Phil January.
And he was considerably older than she was.
I believe it was 14 years.
It was an unexpected love story. He had her not a hello, but get out.
She had an unruly patron, and he came down and saved the day, and it seemed to enamor Nikki to him, and she gave him her phone number, and that's how their relationship started. They were really only together for about 8 months before they got married.
A couple of years later, Phil gets a new job in Louisiana. The family is relocating. According to Bonnie, Phil will go first. Nikki and her son will follow a couple of weeks later. But it is a move Bonnie says her daughter wasn't thrilled about.
She was not looking forward to the move. I remember her saying, yeah, she wasn't really into it.
But the move is happening. Tomorrow, in fact. Today, Nikki needs a babysitter to watch her son. Not because he'll be in the way while she packs, but because Nikki has plans to hang out with a guy she recently met named Eric.
They go to 2 or 3 places, and at the end of the day, he took her to a sports bar, and that is where things got a little weird. She looked at her watch and she said, oh my gosh, I have to make a phone call. Eric tried to hand her his phone, and she goes, oh, no, I'm not taking any chances on that, meaning caller ID. So she left the table and went to the payphone, and when she came back to the table, she was visibly shaken. She was upset, and she said, I have to get out of here right now. I have to leave right now.
Why wouldn't Nikki use Eric's phone? Who did she call? And what got her so rattled? Nikki leaves and picks up her son. It's now around 11 p.m.
She was apologetic because she was a little bit late, but she was fine.
Last stop, home. Nikki and her son had been staying with a friend while Phil was in Louisiana. But on this particular night, they decided to go back to their place. Would that prove to be a tragic mistake? The next morning, 9:45 a.m., a frantic call to 911.
Somebody concerned about him. I was like, suicide. The husband is shot at me. Call 911. He's saying, get an ambulance here, please. He wouldn't get in the apartment. The husband is right here. Okay, who else is supposed to be in there? The son was. The son? Him out. He's 5 years old. We took him out. I don't know what's going on. We've been very concerned about this girl. And we haven't been able to get in touch with her. I was not able to get in touch with her last night. You haven't been up inside the apartment? I walked through. I never saw anything. He walked out on the balcony and started screaming. Is he still inside the apartment right now? I'm seeing him out on the front of the balcony right now. Okay, the officer's on the way.
When past Christian police arrive, on the balcony they find Nikki LaDue January, dead, from a gunshot wound to the head. Cops talk to Nikki's husband, Phil January, who arrived just moments before. He says after finding Nikki, he grabbed the phone from her lap to call 911, but it was dead, so he put it on the table. He also tells police the gun is his. Nikki had asked him to leave it for protection while he was away. Cops also talked to the woman who called 911. Turns out, as Phil was driving from Louisiana to their home in Mississippi, he couldn't get a hold of Nikki, so he asked the woman, a family friend, to go check on her. She says once there, Nikki's young son...
And he answered the door and said, Mommy's sleeping. Went inside, could not find her. Phil shows up.
According to police reports, a shell casing is found downstairs in the pool area. 2 neighbors tell police they heard a loud pop in the early morning hours. Some photos are taken of the scene, then lead investigator Tom Puste and coroner Gary Hargrove wrap up the investigation. Their belief? It's an apparent suicide. They leave without talking to Nikki's son, who was just steps away when the fatal shot rang out.
They spent 2 hours. It's 2 hours and that's it. Suicide.
Phil January calls his in-laws to tell them Nikki's taken her own life.
My world just absolutely fell apart. And I go, what did Nikki take? He goes, what do you mean, what did she take? She shot herself. That was just not even believable. Just completely not believable. She despised guns. And when he told me that he had been with Nikki, I go, there is no way that she could have done that with her beloved child there. She absolutely worshiped and adored that kid. She would never.
Reportedly, after the scene is cleared, Nikki's body isn't taken to the medical examiner's office.
She was taken to the funeral home.
No autopsy will be done. But coroner Gary Hargrove did examine Nikki and wrote in his report, there is gunpowder residue and burning in and around the wound. There were specks of gunpowder on her right hand, and the imprint of the gun could be seen in her hand. Also, Nikki tested positive for cocaine, amphetamines, and alcohol. But none of that convinces Bonnie Nikki committed suicide, so she buries her daughter and prepares for the fight of her life.
If anything was ever going to be learned, it was going to have to be orchestrated by me.
Starting with getting Phil's blessing to exhume Nikki's body.
But my husband and I decided that, painful as it was, we would hire a private pathologist to do an autopsy. So that's what we did.
The pathologist's official finding? Undetermined. But Bonnie says he told her something more.
I remember him clearly telling me, he said, I am going to sign this as undetermined death, but I want to say it's a homicide.
Nikki LaDue January's death was ruled a suicide. Her mother, Bonnie LaDue, says her 30-year-old daughter would never have killed herself, especially with her 5-year-old son just feet away.
I believe she was murdered in cold blood.
Bonnie, along with journalist Norm Whitehurst, who's been writing about Nikki's death, says there are a lot of questions surrounding the crime scene and investigation, starting with how the body and gun were found.
Looks to me like a very unlikely way for a person to commit suicide. She was found sitting in the corner of the balcony with a small glass table in front of her, sitting in a chair. Her right knee was propped up on the table. Her left leg was outstretched.
Bonnie believes Nikki's hands wouldn't naturally end up where they did.
The hand would go to the temple, and then as soon as the shot was made, you would think that the hand would go out, drop the gun, and the hand would end up down there and the gun on the floor. Instead, her hand is very gently covering her left hand, and the gun is under her thigh. It looks completely staged.
She's sitting on the gun almost, right?
She's sitting on the gun.
How do you commit suicide and then after the fact raise your leg to a point where the gun is just going to neatly fall under it?
That doesn't make sense.
Something else that doesn't make sense to them. The cigarettes on the table. One pack was Nikki's brand, the other wasn't.
Any DNA lifted? Fingerprints lifted off the...
They did not look. They
No.
did not look, no.
Nothing
And
off
it
the
was an
cigarettes.
ashtray full of cigarette butts. They cleared the scene in 2 hours without gathering any of the forensic evidence. They just wrote this off as a suicide.
Crime Watch Daily asked forensics expert Dr. Bill Smock to look at the initial investigation and give us his unbiased opinion.
You took a look at Nikki LaDue January's case, right? What were your initial thoughts?
Polaroid pictures of the crime scene, no autopsy performed, minimal effort on part of the investigator. This is not the way to do an investigation.
And Smock agrees the location of the gun looks suspicious.
The way the gun was found tucked under her leg, I think somebody intentionally, unintentionally, moved that gun and stuck it under her left leg.
But right there should warrant an investigation because it means the scene was disturbed.
Absolutely.
There's also the case of the cigarette butts, right? 2 different packages of cigarettes. No DNA tests?
No DNA test.
I mean, head scratching, right?
This is perplexing. I think this police department should answer why, if you do not conduct an autopsy, you don't answer those basic questions about what happened. How can you clear this case if you don't do basic investigative steps?
But Smock says the blood evidence does point to something definitive. Nikki having both hands on the gun.
I didn't see any forward spatter where the bullet came out of the left side of her head. She did have back spatter on the back of her hand, actually on both hands, but it was predominant on the back of her left hand.
And what does that indicate?
Well, what it can indicate is if you are holding the gun, for example, if you were to take a gun, put it to your head, and then you put your left hand on the barrel to hold it steady, then you get spatter on the back of this hand, and it kind of protects any spatter from coming on the fingers or your forearm.
And in this case, would Nikki LaDue have had both her hands on the firearm?
Based upon the pattern, it looks like she had both her left hand on the barrel and the right hand on the handle of the gun.
Did Nikki or someone else possibly put her hands in that position? Some say Nikki's relationship with her husband Phil January may hold some critical answers. Norm Whitehurst even alleges there was emotional abuse in the house.
Describe Nikki and Phil's relationship, their marriage in particular.
If you talk to Phil, which I did, it was a marriage made in heaven. If you talk to her friends and her family, quite the opposite. She described feeling threatened in a way that he needed to control her. He would leave notes on cupboard doors in their apartment that would disparage her, that would call her vile names.
Was Nikki planning on staying in the relationship, or was she looking for a way out?
According to Phil, they were going to move to Louisiana, but there's a few friends who have said, no, that's not the case. What Nikki told us is that she's done. She can't take it anymore.
Was Nikki about to leave Phil? What was going on in the hours leading up to her death? According to Whitehurst, what was going on was a flurry of phone calls.
There was several phone calls between Nikki and Phil. Phil was supposedly driving back from Louisiana. The phone calls took place, I believe, between 1 and 2:30 in the morning. I think there's 14, 15 calls.
Why so many calls? What were they talking about? And did Phil January have an alibi that night? Whitehurst says cops looked into it.
They were able to pull phone records that showed that the number was blocked. And that's all they know. They didn't do anything like checking with cell phone towers for pinging and things like that to see what his location was. He could have been 300 miles away. He could have been in the same room as her.
According to the police report, January told cops he talked to Nikki once at 1:45 a.m. And there was something else that some consider strange. After investigators found what they called a suicide note on January's home computer, Phil had the hard drive of the computer wiped clean.
He had his teenage son erase the hard drive so he would never see that note. Come to find out, or as Phil says it, that wasn't a suicide note at all.
So it wasn't even a suicide note?
It was. She was apologizing and telling him that she wants to be a better person or a better wife.
Okay, but he tells his son to wipe the computer clean?
That's correct.
In Bonnie's desperate search for answers, she hires two private investigators. One of them interviews Phil January. The audio from that meeting was recorded.
How would you characterize your relationship with Nikki? Nikki was my wife. Did Nikki ever say that she did not want to do this before? No.
January describes the moment he found his wife.
First thing I thought was she had fallen asleep out there, until I actually saw her. And you seen the picture, so you know what I saw.
And the position of the gun, which he says he didn't touch, left him feeling unsettled.
Very odd. And I remember thinking that at the time. And not only that, it's turned opposite of what it, to me, looks like somebody in front of her would have placed it, not what you would have placed it yourself. And now, by all indications, Nikki did not like guns. She hated them.
January even admits to having the computer's hard drive erased after the alleged suicide note was found.
I had my son do it. And what reason? I didn't ever want to see it. I told him to get rid of everything.
Interestingly enough, January believes, like his mother-in-law, Nikki would not have taken her own life.
You think she would have did that? Nikki would never have done that.
So who could have wanted Nikki dead? An ominous theory has emerged.
There are some people that think that it could have been organized crime that killed her. I've heard the word, this was a warning, this is a warning. Why Nikki was chosen to be the victim, I don't know. But there are people that think that this was a warning, whether it was a warning to the people that were at the casino, whether it was a warning to Phil. I don't know.
Allegedly, Nikki had received 3 threatening notes in her locker at the casino around the time of her death.
The 3 notes, did you ever see it? In fact, she told me she'd thrown them all away. What was the gist of the notes? You know, she said the notes called her a and she was being threatened.
Do those notes hold the key to Nikki's death? Bonnie LaDue says her daughter, Nikki LaDue January, did not commit suicide. She believes her daughter was murdered.
I believe that the only place that she could be allowed to go is to her grave. Her death took place, I believe, because she was about to start a new life. She was about to get away from the entire scenario that she had lived within.
That scenario, Bonnie believes, was the seedy underworld of the casino where she worked.
I do not think it is out of the realm of possibility that Nikki came into contact with information that could hurt somebody. I also believe that her association with Phil January sealed her fate.
Phil January, Nikki's husband, who also thinks it could have been foul play. Bonnie and Phil January at least agree on that, but journalist Norm Whitehurst says January may know more.
Whether he actually did it, I don't know, but he may have answers.
So we thought we'd try to talk to Phil January. We emailed him, but he never responded, so we went in person to see if he had any more information beyond his earlier taped interview. Anything to help Bonnie get clarification on what happened to Nikki that horrible night.
Mr. January, my name's Jason Matera with Crime Watch Daily. We're doing a story on the death of Nikki, your wife, and we're hoping you can shed some light on what may have happened to her. We interviewed some other people. Do you think she committed suicide?
Not the way to do it.
You don't want to talk? We're giving you an opportunity to tell us what may have happened. I mean, there was allegations, Phil, that you were abusive towards Nikki. Do you want to respond to that? No, we're giving you an opportunity. Are you trying to hide something? You don't want to talk at all? There he goes, right over there. And the outstanding question remains. Did Nikki LaDue January commit suicide, or was she murdered?
January didn't want to talk, but independent forensics expert Dr. Bill Smock did have one more thing to say. He was able to come to some sort of conclusion that, interestingly, could lift the veil of suspicion off Phil January, or anyone else.
So what's your gut tell you? Suicide or not?
Based on what I saw, it's probably a suicide.
What makes you determine that?
Unfortunately, I don't have a lot to go on, but from what I see, with the back spatter on the back of her hand, that's telling me that it was Nikki's hand was here on the barrel when the trigger was pulled. And in that case, I think it's a suicide.
Going forward will be an uphill battle.
Where does Bonnie go from here?
I don't think they're going to reopen the investigation because there's nothing to investigate. The crime scene was wiped clean. There is no DNA evidence. There are no fingerprints. There's nothing. You know, short of somebody saying, I did it, I don't know that she's ever going to find any answers.
But Bonnie says she'll never be deterred. She'll never stop fighting, hoping someday soon that someone will come forward and help her get the answers she's so desperately seeking of what happened to her daughter, Nikki.
I do this, and I will continue to do it until I have the truth. But I really and truly need to know who and why. Why my oldest daughter is in her grave rather than, you know, living her life. And some people can accept that they may never know, and I'm not one of them. I just need to know. I'm a mom.
In a strange twist, the lead investigator who worked Nikki's case was himself arrested. Officer Thomas Puste was convicted of several sex crimes against a child. While he was in prison, Nikki's mom wrote him a series of letters hoping he would shed new light on the investigation of her daughter's death. During their lengthy conversation, Puste would write that he remembered thinking several things about the scene were odd and that he didn't have a very favorable first impression of Nikki's husband, Phil. However, to this day, the investigator has no doubt that Nikki took her own life.